Welcome to Columbia Business School Executive Education. I'm Mark Roberts, Senior Associate Dean of Exec Ed, and I'm really pleased to kick off today's webinar, Leading into the Future. Before I introduce Professors Stefan Meyer and Dan Wang, who are going to be leading the session with us today, I'd like to cover just a few quick practical points. As you'll see on this slide, first of all, note that we will be recording the session. So the good news is that you will get a recording of the session sent to you in your inbox soon after the webinar. Please do follow us on LinkedIn for our latest news and updates. Just search for Columbia Business School Executive Education. And finally, but maybe most importantly, please submit any questions that you've got during the session in the Q&A box. And then we'll use the last 5 or 10 minutes of the session to get through as many of those as possible. It's now my pleasure to introduce our two presenters today, Stefan Meyer and Dan Wang. Stefan is the James P. Gorman Professor of Business at Columbia Business School and the Chair of the Management Division. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Zurich and was previously a senior economist at the Center for Behavioral Economics and Decision Making at the Federal Reserve Bank. His research and teaching interests are focused on the human side of strategy. His work has been published in leading academic journals and has been covered by news outlets all around the globe. I'm also really pleased to introduce Dan Wang. Dan is an associate professor of business at Columbia Business School and the co-director of the Tamer Center for Social Enterprise. He earned his BA from Columbia University and has a PhD from Stanford. His research examines how social networks drive social and economic transformation through the analysis of global migration, social movements, organizational innovation, and entrepreneurship. Both Stefan and Dan are faculty co-directors of our new upcoming executive development program, Leading into the Future, which is going to be taking place from June the 6th through to September the 22nd this year. Dan and Stefan, thank you for leading the session, and it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Mark, for this nice introduction. So Dan and I are super happy to have this webinar and talk a little bit about like how we think about the future and the future of business, and that affects kind of what research we're doing, but also how we design our executive programs at the moment and going forward. So when I just think about like what we were teaching our students for many years and executives, you know, when you think about what the responsibility of leaders and executives were, is kind of to make the connection between strategy and capability. So that meant, you know, we had to look inside to what are we actually good at, and then design a competitive advantage or a value proposition that created a sustainable competitive advantage in the market environment. It was relatively static and needed to like update in every couple of years, but that's kind of what Dan and I teach our students in our MBA core class, and we still think it's going to be important to have that foundation. However, there are a couple of really important trends that are going to change how leaders have to think about their business now and in the future. So let's talk about two that Dan and I think are like super important. One is about data. You know, we all know data, automation, AI is going to here to stay. But what is sometimes a little harder to grasp is how fast it's actually going to change. When you look at, on the left-hand side here, you have a graph which has like the forecast for robots, the demand for robots, here robots revenue, and you see it's increasing extremely fast. So it goes up here, you know, when you look at from 2000, 2020, you know, it increases dramatically. But what is actually true is that it increases exponentially. And now that we were through COVID, you know, we kind of know what exponential means. It means like it goes extremely fast. If we are not prepared of what's going to happen in that market, we're going to lose out extremely fast, not only in our lifetime, but in the next couple of years. Just to illustrate that a little more, when you think about what happened in the last couple of years, you know, in the last 10, 20 years, where internet, social media platform become relevant, of course, we need to know, you know, how to digitalize our business, how we think about social media, how we think about digital marketing and whatnot. but it's going to go much, much faster. You can basically plot any data on like how good are we going to be in artificial intelligence? You know, what about robotics, as I just showed you? What about blockchain? How fast are computers? How much data we have? We see this exponential growth. And that means if we are not changing something now, we're going to be way behind in just a couple of years. You know, if you look at the scale here, you know, from 2010 then to 2020 and 2025, you know, it goes extremely, extremely fast, and we need to prepare for that. Now that's not all that's going to change. So Dan, what else are like trends that you see?
Well, that's a wonderful segue, Stefan, because I see the big change with data and automation in that it's not only just going to become more ubiquitous, but it's going to be distributed among more and more complex stakeholders. And so your point about how this is one big trend that's going to change for business leaders is accompanied by another big trend that I see in terms of stakeholder complexity. And so what stakeholders basically refer to is any party around a business that makes value creation possible for that business. And so let me give you a quick visual contrast of two kinds of stakeholder maps. If you were operating GM in the 20th century, then you would be primarily concerned about three types of stakeholders: suppliers, who make and supply the parts that you need to make your cars; shareholders, to whom you have to return value; and employees, whom you have to empower in order to make cars and sell cars as well. That's true of almost any traditional firm. But as we look forward to new types of technologies, such as in the area of autonomous vehicles, the stakeholder map, the kinds of data, the kind of technologies that need to be integrated are far more complex than ever before. So let me give you a stakeholder map visual of a company that's heavily involved in autonomous vehicles, one that you might not think is, but actually has a huge stake in it. And that's NVIDIA. NVIDIA is a manufacturer and creator of chips and semiconductors. And here's its stakeholder map when it comes to its involvement in the autonomous vehicle sector. It's a lot more complicated. It entails not just suppliers, not just software engineering firms, but also ride-hailing firms such as Lyft and Uber, and car manufacturers as well. To drive this point home about how data and stakeholder complexity are two trends that are becoming increasingly important to CEOs and executives today, let me talk about what a year or 2 years in the Uber CEO's, Dara Khosrowshahi's life has been. This is just the past 2 years, ever since the onset of the pandemic. So it began in June 2020, just a couple of months after the pandemic began to shut things down, where Khosrowshahi had to confront social activists in front of his house, demanding responses about pandemic pay and other things that Uber was going to do. So that's one actor that the Uber CEO had to deal with. A few months later, in 2021, Uber released statement about how it was declaring new cultural values to combat the toxicity that had pervaded its internal culture. And so that's a function of HR and culture that the CEO had to deal with. A few months after that, Dara Khosrowshahi is a user of his own company's product. And so every couple of times a year, what he does is that he actually goes and makes deliveries on behalf of Uber Eats or gives rides on behalf of Uber ride hailing. So that's product and user experience. A few months after that, he was appointed to be on the board of Aurora Technologies, which took over Uber's autonomous vehicles arm. And so he has to be a technologist and R&D specialist there. A few months after that, he had to lead an earnings call, which he has to do every quarter. So he has to have expertise in corporate finance. And then during that same month, he had to be an expert on regulatory strategy as a way of testifying and also communicating with the Biden administration. So clearly, these are many different skill sets that are very, very difficult ultimately for the traditionally trained executive to respond to. And so the way that we think about how executives have to learn today or have to act today is not so much about knowing different domains, but being in a constant mode of adaptation and learning. And so for us, the point of how we think about the future of work and the future of business is that to future-proof your business, the learn it all does better than the know it all. And so how do executives learn? So what we'd like to do is present you with a basic framework to think about all of the domains that an executive today and in the future has to have command of. And then we're going to take you through two quick vignettes, two quick cases that applies this very framework. And the way that we're going to frame this framework is we're going to call it the Learning Executives Framework. And it starts by zooming out from internal capabilities all the way out to all the external stakeholders that you've just seen a little snippet of today. So what does a learning executive have to do? Well, internally, they have to be able to practice having a vision, deliver values, and also practice the art of persuasion. But the reason why the executive has to have these capabilities is because ultimately they have to be internal managers as well. Their internal responsibilities to those shareholders and stakeholders in the firm means that they have to empower their employees, they have to catalyze and motivate their executive team. In addition, they also have to align the company's goals with the shareholders and investors. For many folks who received their MBAs over the past 3, 4, 5 decades, this is familiar. But what's unfamiliar is how these same skills have to be applied to external and managing external stakeholders, because the external stakeholders have just as much to do with how a company and executive leads value creation and value capture today as the internal stakeholders. And by external stakeholders, I'm referring not just to supply chain partners and market competitors and rivals, those are market stakeholders, but non-market stakeholders as well. These are regulators and community leaders. All of this is occur against the backdrop of 2 major trends of digitization, technological adoption and automation, and also big changes in the environment and climate change as well. And so the learning executive also has to be attuned to these major changes. And so what we're going to do now is familiarize you with this framework through 2 quick vignettes. And the 2 vignettes that we're going to take you through as I pass it over to my colleague Stefan is about building the future of hybrid work. And then he'll pass it over to me where I'll talk about how autonomous vehicles development resolves stakeholder complexity.
Thank you so much, Dan. So I want to talk about quickly about the future of work. And it's obvious that, when you think about the framework again, there's obviously technology, digitalization, automation. I just showed you how robots and AI are going to be better. That affects kind of how we think about the employees. That affects how we think about competition, and also it really affects how leaders have to lead and manage in the future. Now, the future of work actually affects 3 parts. This is a slide that I got from Deloitte. It affects how we think about work. What activities are humans doing? What are machines doing? How the interaction between humans and machine are interacting. It affects how we think about the workforce. Career, how do you think about skills, upskilling of our employees? Careers are going to be very different in the future, because the half-life of knowledge is decreasing so fast that within a couple of years, what you learned before has to be reimagined. And the third is what is now on top of mind of everybody nowadays. It's the workplace. How we think about the workplace is going to look like, and I'm going to dive deeper a little bit into that in the next couple of minutes. Now, obviously, you need to have all 3 in place. So with Jeff Schwartz, who is my partner in crime when I teach future of work in our MBA and also in our executive education program. We have a workbook that kind of brings everything together and looks about how strategy affects that. But now let's talk about hybrid work, because everybody talks about it. As with everything about the future, we don't really know. There is a lot of uncertainty. That means that some executives, here is the Morgan Stanley CEO, I'm the James B. Gorman professor, so this is the person who gave my chair. He thinks people should be back in the office. It just doesn't work to be remote or hybrid. On the other extreme, or tech companies like LinkedIn, who think the future might be all remote. And then there are companies in between. Amazon asks them to come back, and then and so it's still in flux. Most of this discussion has to do with thinking about what do our employees want? When you look at the discussions, it's always, well, we have to do it because our employees really want it. In fact, when I ask executive, what do you want personally? They often say, I want a lot of flexibility. And when I ask them, what do you want as a leader? They're like, well, I want them to be back in the office. But I can't do that really. I think this is missing somehow the point, even though research shows that giving hybrid option actually lowers attrition. But I think we have to completely reimagining the work. And I think 3 questions are important to ask. First is when, where, and how do we do the most productive work? We obviously knew and experienced in the pandemic, certain things are going to be better in remote work. We might be more focused. Certain tasks we can actually do better at home. And when doing so, we have to think about, and this is this matrix here on the left, we have to think about how do we restrict place and time. The traditional model was like, we're in the office 9 to 5. Now we can think about, we are actually unconstraining time. Does it matter that we have synchronous time together? Does it matter that we're in the office at the same time, or can we come at any time? And then there is place. Does it matter where we are? Maybe not, but we need to have synchronous time where we work together on Zoom. That, of course, or is it like we can do anywhere, anytime? That, of course, matters a ton when you think about what tasks should be done together and what should not. Should we restrict in what time zone people live? Because if time is important, that we actually interact with each other for a couple of hours a day, we should restrict kind of the time. Or does it matter that we bump into each other in the office, then we have to restrict the place. The second, and I'm going to talk a little more about them in the next slide, is like what management and leadership practices need to change. What we did before does not work in a hybrid, or even in a remote, or even in a hybrid workplace. So we need to think about how should we lead differently, whether we lead small teams or whether we lead a large organization. And the last is, what data do I need? What do I need to know about my employees? If you think about management, in the 9 to 5, it was kind of clear that we are available 9 to 5. And now when we come whenever, maybe it's like not 9 to 5 anymore. Some people start later. In fact, during the pandemic, you saw that like the number of emails that were sent between 6 and midnight at night increased by like 40 or even more percent at each point. Do we know when our employees actually interact? And so what data do we need to do that? That needs a shift in how we think about it. Think about it like consumers. You wouldn't say when you're in a consumer business, let's ask our consumers once a year how they're doing and what they're doing. Obviously not, but that's exactly what we do with our employees. We ask them once a year, how engaged they are. I mean, we all know that we hate those engagement surveys, but that's basically the data and the insight we had on our employees. We need to change this. Now, what needs to change? Obviously, a lot of things work in remote and hybrid. Certain things don't. Think about performance evaluation. There is research showing that if you do telecommuting, that was before the pandemic, that increases productivity but lowers the rate on which those people who were remote were promoted. Because out of sight of your supervisor kind of means also out of mind when promotions were ready. How do we deal with that? How we change to only evaluate output and not just input? Think about corporate culture. Obviously, thinking about the norms in meetings. Do we all need those meetings? What norms should be in meetings, especially if there is hybrid? Those who are not in the meeting, are they excluded? We all know most of the most important part in an in-person meeting are actually before and after the meeting. If you just zoom in, you're not in that particular part of the meeting. How do we deal with that? Do we have like explicit norms about how meetings are going to be set? Third, think about the innovation. Is it important that we have spontaneous interactions? When you just schedule Zoom calls, you're not going to have those water cooler moments that some of us think are really important. Now, this is a lot. In fact, when I teach this to executives and leaders, I say your job is going to be even more hard. It's going to get harder and harder to deal with. One way to break it down is I'm actually asking executive to think about how good is your remote hybrid workplace or team strategy doing on fill in the blanks. Pick 5, 10 attributes that you think the workplace is important, and then you think about how is our remote hybrid strategy working, and give yourself a grade from 1, it's going terribly, to 10, it's going well. And then you tackle the dimension where you score the lowest and start to think about how can we actually create a workplace that is going to be better than the one before. Importantly, and that's not only for workplace strategy, but for everything with future of work, is you have to move away from just thinking about cost. You know, this is, oh, we have to do hybrid because we can lower some real estate costs. We have to do hybrid because people actually want it. You have to reimagining the workplace to create more value and then more meaning. We're all aware of that in our consumer market, where like 10, 15 years ago, we moved from just cost to like, let's create meaning, let's create purpose in our consumer brands. We have to do exactly the same when we think about our employees. Think about how can we use technology to actually create the place that is now better than it was before. How can you create the hybrid version that is actually better than the one we had before, but that requires a lot of changes about how we lead and how we manage our team or our organization going forward. Dan, over to you.
So what Stefan talked about largely was how the future of work and the future of business is going to affect internal stakeholders. I'm going to turn to a topic that looks at the shifting demand and also the shifting technologies that are going to be governing the future of mobility as a business as well. And one of the biggest parts of trying to understand what the future of mobility looks like is also about understanding how complex the stakeholder environment looks like as well. Let me just say is that with our framework, this is one way of getting insight into how defining trends across the macroeconomic environment are reshaping the way that executives are thinking about their roles within companies. In fact, one of the biggest trends that autonomous vehicles, that is driverless cars, can contribute to is that research suggests that if it's the case today that we adopted 40% of all vehicles, transformed all of them into autonomous vehicles with our current level of autonomous vehicle technology, then that would automatically reduce carbon emissions by 30%, simply because of the efficient gains. These are still fuel-driven cars, but this is just the impact that autonomous vehicles can have on this external environment as well. No doubt, there's also a potentially huge market for autonomous vehicles as well. In fact, the compound annual growth rate for this entire market is about 22% each year for the next decade. If you compare that to some other kind of tech adjacent or tech relevant industries such as big data, streaming video on demand like Netflix and space tourism, it exceeds all of those as well. And so this is a big market with an enormous growth potential and the potential to have a huge social and environmental impact as well. It is true that this is also a market that has lots of players. I showed you a stakeholder map earlier in our webinar. This is kind of a more complete picture of all of the companies that are working on autonomous vehicles technology. And they range from computer vision specialists to AI services, to car manufacturers, to ride sharing platforms as well. So there's a lot of companies involved in this, lots of different stakeholders involved in this as well. And so one thing that I want to show you, however, is that there are some central themes that animate all of the companies in this space. And as it turns out, one big question among the many that none of these companies have really gotten a hold of is their role in enabling autonomous vehicles to make decisions in ethically ambiguous scenarios. What you're seeing here is a graph that comes from data that we collected here at Columbia Business Schools in our research on autonomous vehicles. And the takeaway from these graphs basically is that ultimately, when you ask a representative set of consumers what they care most about in terms of autonomous vehicles technology and what do they have the least confidence in autonomous vehicles to do, it's not to keep them safe. Some people are concerned about that, but it's really their confidence in the autonomous vehicle to make the right moral decision. And so what do I mean by the right moral decision? Well, here's kind of a classic representation of what this looks like. So this is a dilemma that's often used to talk about moral decision-making when it comes to driverless cars. This is something called the helmet problem. And so what does this refer to? Well, it refers to the scenario where an autonomous vehicle is driving down the road, the brakes cut out, so the autonomous vehicle cannot ultimately brake in time. In front of the vehicle, there are two cyclists, and the autonomous vehicle has to make a decision on whether to not swerve and kill one of the cyclists or swerve and potentially kill the other cyclist. The issue, however, is that one of the cyclists has a helmet on. And with computer vision technology today, the autonomous vehicle recognizes that. And somebody has to program which cyclist ultimately to threaten in this scenario. Now, this is a dilemma, because on the one hand, you could say, well, you should always program the vehicle to hit the cyclist with the helmet on, because they arguably have a higher chance of surviving the crash. But then another side would say, well, why would you program the vehicle to intentionally hit the cyclist that made the right decision to wear a helmet and ultimately punish that individual? So this is a classic moral dilemma. And there are lots of different stakeholders when it comes to deciding, stakeholders' opinions when it comes to making this moral decision. In fact, there are autonomous vehicles companies themselves, there are people who are in the cars, there's government and regulators who are weighing in, and also there are ethicists, university professors who also have opinions on this as well. So how do you get all of these different stakeholders together and have them render a decision? Because they're going to be disagreeing about this. And so one thing you can say is that, why don't you let individuals just program their own ethical settings into their autonomous vehicles? And the principal benefit of that is that you make people feel in control. But based on a number of different tests and research findings, we see that there are enormous risks to having individuals program their own ethical settings. So that's when you have to bring in these other stakeholders. But then the question becomes, well, how do you actually bring them together in a way that empowers their decision making? How do you prioritize this? And one way to begin thinking about this, which is what we'll teach you, is that you have to give stakeholders a framework for collaboration. So what does this framework look like? Well, it depends on two dimensions. The first is the kind of ethical expertise required to make a decision. The second is what the stakes of the decision, whether it's life or death. When it comes to low expertise and low stakes, maybe you do let individual human riders in the car program their own decision-making preferences. If it's low expertise, but high stakes, life or death, maybe it's policymakers who are generalists in this area who you prioritize in their opinion. When it comes to high stakes and also high expertise required, that's when you bring in these rare scenarios, ethicists and social scientists. And if it's high stakes and low stakes and high expertise required, then perhaps autonomous vehicles companies themselves can handle this type of thing. This is a framework that you can use to think about these kinds of tricky ethical scenarios in a number of different technologies that apply AI and machine learning as well, such as just reading resumes based on algorithms, using AI natural language to deliver chat conversations. There are lots of different ways to begin thinking about this. But I want to point is that there's a connection between the two scenarios that Stefan and I talk about. And so to wrap up, let me turn it over to my colleague.
So I hope by now, are you ready to lead into the future? So obviously not after a 20 minutes webinar. So we talked, I think what you should take away is, we talked about two potential decisions that you have to take going forward and prepare and future-proof your business. However, there are many others. You have to think about cybersecurity, how to think about blockchain, how to lead with big data, how you think about innovation, diversity, CSR, and so on and so forth. In fact, in the program that Dan and I are designing, we actually taking all those aspects that you now see on the slide and put them into a session to really prepare you for a lot of aspects that we're going to hit you in the future. And I want to come back to kind of that quote from Nadella, who says the learn it all does better than the know it all. It's exciting to think about what the future is going to bring, because we can learn what the future is going to bring. And this is kind of the core of this growth mindset that Nadella had in mind, also what kind of is the philosophy behind our program that we're designing right now. So with that, I'm gonna stop now and leave time for questions. So Mark, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Dan and Stefan. You're right that a bunch of questions have been coming in, throughout the session. I'm going to start, if I can, with a question from Manvendra, who says, is the learn it all approach applicable to the entire workforce? Can you talk about how this can be applied to an organization's culture rather than just to individual executives?
Absolutely. Maybe I can kick it off here. I absolutely think that this growth mindset and kind of empowering the employees on any level is an important part of this transformation and creating organizations that are agile enough to be prepared in the future. There is not, as a leader, you might be able to know some, but, tapping into the knowledge, the ambition and empowering the employees is going to be super important. But in fact, Nadella did that at Microsoft, instilled kind of this growth mindset in the whole organization. And I think turns out when you look at Microsoft and the turnaround he was able to achieve, turned out to be very successful.
I think that's entirely right. Stefan covered a lot of it, but I really appreciate your question, because the one thing that I would add is that there's another benefit to creating a culture of learning within an organization, especially if you are a leader and can lead by example, is that it creates another element of a unique value proposition to employees for companies as well. Because you can offer them an environment of continuous learning, that's something that can help differentiate a company in terms of attracting high quality talent as well. I mean, we have plenty of anecdotes from many of our students who have gone on to work for companies who have intentionally sought out organizations that have environments that have really quality instruction and actually incentivizes their employees to try to learn through programs like this.
Thank you both. I've got another question that's come in from Andre. So he's saying, as the COVID-19 pandemic has changed how we do business and manage teams, are you seeing any emerging technologies or different ways that employees can be brought into a company, and or how an organization can build resilient teams?
That's a great question. I would say that there are a number of different platform-based solutions that can help with connecting asynchronously. And also there are new technologies that are emerging almost by the month, by the week really, that seek to replicate some of the spontaneous or missing spontaneous interactions that Stefan has talked about as well. I think the real question, and one question that we're going to explore and offer some solutions to, and also some debate about in the program that we run, is about how do you effectively coordinate across different places. Different types of work that were previously place constrained, we learned during the pandemic did not have to be place constrained. And so we have to use technology in a meaningful way to try to get the most out of the value, while at the value of employees and workers, while at the same time making sure that they have a meaningful work environment, however virtual they are.
Great, thank you. I've got another question which is taking us down a slightly different track, but we've got an anonymous question saying, would geopolitical be a third factor on the outside of the circle, along with technology, digitization, automation, and environment and climate change? Do you have any thoughts?
Maybe I can kick us off. I think absolutely. We have in fact labeled that trend as like global macro factor. So I think absolutely that the geopolitical situation is hugely important, and we see this now, sadly, with the war in Ukraine, that this is not something that leaders can stand, be silent about. One of it affects actually their supply chain and their market as well, but it also affects kind of, and Dan is the expert in that, like, should they say something about this? Where should they put a stand on one side or the other? And back in the days where like CEOs were like being apolitical, you shouldn't make any comment. That changed dramatically with like CEO activisms.
Yeah, there's actually quite a bit of research on this coming out recently by our colleagues here at Columbia Business School, as well as elsewhere as well, that we try to integrate in this. But the key point that Stefan made is something I want to emphasize again, is that the traditional view on this is that the reason why an executive, at any level, not just the C-suite, should not take a political side or on the ideological spectrum, is that they might alienate half of their stakeholders who might be on the other side of the spectrum. But as it turns out, things have changed so dramatically in the past 10 years, primarily through generational shifts, that not taking a position is also effectively taking a position. And the key element to remember about this is that if you don't take a position and articulate it in a way that's meaningful, but also one that's empathetic, then others will take a position for you. And so part of the goal in our sessions is helping executives and future leaders understand how they should articulate some of these very views that might be controversial, of course, but also it's something that executives have to deal with.
Great, thank you. I've got another question which is focusing in on, is a broader question around leadership. So Gabanga asks or says the future is uncertain, and you've kind of made that point. However, what are the core leadership habits that are required in your view?
Mm-hmm. Well, so one thing I always tell the executives that I teach is, first of all, and I mentioned that the job is becoming is harder, but it also makes it a little bit more deliberate. You can't really wing it anymore. When you think about culture and remote work, you often hear like, oh, if people don't come into office, what do we do with corporate culture? That goes down the drain. Now, let's be honest, before the pandemic, when it was all in person, about 50% of the workplaces had toxic work cultures. It was not particularly good then. But now it's actually, we need to be much more deliberate about what we actually do about this. So that makes all those decisions, I think, like norms about meetings. We all complained about meetings in the past, and now we have to be much more deliberate. Do we need that meeting? Can that meeting be on Zoom? Does it need to be in person? Can we just send an email? So can it be asynchronous? If we all make those changes, I think we're creating organizations that are much better than it was before, by being just more deliberate on stuff that leaders needed to do before, but thought they can kind of wing it. Because we were in the same office.
I think I couldn't agree more. I think what the pandemic has done, it has surfaced to many leaders who previously only had to be concerned with their fiduciary responsibilities if they were executives in charge of a public company, to realize just how big of an effect that non-market and external stakeholders have on their businesses. And so this, of course, includes employees who are direct employees, but also contract employees, also activists, also those who are concerned with the environment. And these are all trends about which there's a complete uncertainty. And so the kind of executive that has to deal with these is also one that's aware of what they actually don't know. And so in being able to learn and adapt and also design their organization a way to multiply the channels of communication about this expertise that they might not be an expert in is something that we think about a lot. It requires not just a change in mindset, but also a change in structure of the organization. It's something that we're hoping to bring in our program as well.
Okay, I think we'll go for two more questions before we wrap up. So we'll keep the answers as punchy as possible if we can. Kirk is asking, how do you manage generational diversity on your team within a hybrid environment?
That's a good question. I mean, I definitely think that taking into account that, generations, preferences change. And they're changing quite dramatically. Dan was talking about how, newer generation care about other issues, maybe more strongly, and actually voice their opinion. And technology also helps them to voice their opinion, and then it can go viral very quickly. But when you think about the workplace, I do think that we have to think much more carefully about what actually motivates our employees. And I do a lot of research about what is motivating. Money, I care about money myself. If my dean would lower my salary by 50%, I would be pretty upset. Even if he gave me some flowers for my office. But there is like more than just income. There is meaning, purpose. There is autonomy and power, empowering of the employees that are super important. And it's becoming to the generational point. I think it becomes more and more important. I think everybody changes, but those younger generation and cohorts care about it much more. For reasons I don't really know, but it's definitely a fact that leaders have to take into account. And then manage, as probably the question was also alluding to, different generations in the same workplace. How do people who are 50 and 60, who like to go to the office, how are they different than like people who are 20 and 25? And I think that also is an important insight. We have to treat people different. They are different. If you think about consumers, you would never assume that every consumer is the same. You tailor it to your consumer. You have to do the same with your employees, and being aware that they're different. And in fact, that is a good thing to say, like, yeah, you want to come to the office, you can come to the office. You do your best work when you're sometimes at home or even always at home, you can do that too. And kind of tailor it in a way that like actually captures those individual differences, whether they come from generational differences or just differences in the, you know, times are different now.
Mm-hmm. I agree. In addition to recognizing differences, I think all of this falls under the umbrella of also acknowledging several universals that always kind of exist when it comes to promoting a strong corporate culture in which everyone is cohesively committed to a given mission as well. And one of those things relates to something that we teach here in our MBA and executive MBA curriculum at Columbia Business School, which is this notion of inclusive leadership. You know, this idea of recognizing differences and understanding that not everyone has the same view, but can also be included via important team structures that can be scaled and transferred to other units. This is a really important way to think about how the mindset of a manager changes, not just by incentivizing individual workers, but incentivizing collaboration, also collective decision-making as well. And there are different kinds of structures for that we think about to take advantage of differences rather than completely kind of splitting people apart.
Great, thank you, Stefan and Dan. Time has kind of flown by. As always, you've covered a huge amount of ground in a very short space of time. Thank you to everybody who's been asking questions along the way. We will share the slides. I know some people mentioned some difficulties reading those, so we'll make sure you get a copy of the slides as well as a recording of the video. We're really looking forward to your new program, Stefan and Dan. So the executive development program leading into the future. You've definitely whet our appetite today and given us plenty to think about. To wrap up, on behalf of Columbia Business School Exec Ed, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. We really hope you enjoyed the webinar. I hope you can join us again soon, either on campus or online. And thank you again for attending, and have a good day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.